Hey, welcome everybody to this Edge of Mind podcast, where really it's such a delight for me to introduce you to a dear friend, someone I really consider a colleague along the path, someone I have such enormous respect for, and who's taken the time out of his really busy life to hang with us for a little bit. So I'll read a brief, abbreviated biography, and then we're just going to jump into a host of really cool topics. So Cortland Dahl Ph.D. is a leading expert on mindfulness, meditation, in the science of well-being. His eclectic background includes long periods of solitary retreat in the Himalayan foothills of Nepal and the translation of ancient Tibetan meditation manuals, as well as cutting-edge research on the science of well-being and the creation of an acclaimed meditation app. He's a scientist, author, translator, entrepreneur, and meditation teacher, an all-round general good guy. But his true passion is using ancient wisdom and modern science to help people flourish. So the one thing I do have to say before I turn it over to you, Court, is you're the first person to get a PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in mind, brain, and contemplative science. Congratulations on that. But my favorite thing where I really am jealous of you is you have the title Chief Contemplative Officer. I just think that is so cool. So welcome, my dear friend. It's so great to
So
spend a few
great to be
minutes with
here with
you.
you. Yeah, I'm delighted to be on. The respect and love goes both ways, so it's an honor to be here with you and to share some airtime with you for a few minutes.
Yeah, I really appreciate the kind words. So let's start just a little bit. I mean, one of your great gifts is, in fact, this kind of daimonic liminal nature of your being. You're a polymath. You know, you're a Renaissance man. You have so many capabilities on so many different fronts. And one of them is, in fact, intimated in this very title of your PhD, contemplative science. So let's start a little bit with that, because I think this is one of the most compelling things. And then we'll turn to your book and your translations and stuff like that, which I have here, by the way. I show and tell. This shows you I put my money where my mouth is. Court has translated dozens of books. This is one of my favorites. The Great Perfection Dzogchen is another one. You know, we'll turn to those a little bit. And then we're going to turn to his most recent book, which is what inspired me to reach out to him. This one here, Meditator's Guide to Buddhism, The Path of Awareness, Compassion, and Wisdom. So we have a ton of things to talk about. But let's start with this really compelling notion of contemplative science and what exactly that is, because I see you as one of your great gifts is the creation of bridges, gentle bridges, which is actually, interestingly enough, the title of the very first Mind and Life books, the one that Jeremy Hayward and Francesca Varela edited. And so the question is, you know, along these lines is, as a bridge builder, are you in fact building bridges, or are you forcing marriages? In other words, are we looking at a shotgun marriage when we talk about science and spirituality, and what you see is actually the bridge building and actually cultural building process that takes place in that.
Oh man, wow. Well, we could easily geek out in just this one question, not only for this hour, but probably days if we wanted to. Yeah, despite having done a variety of things over the course of my career and life and having a lot of weird job titles, I think at heart I'm a translator. I'm one of these people
Mm,
that's standing between worlds and helping them make sense of one another, helping knowledge and wisdom flow hopefully a little more freely between them. And I would say that we have a kind of a cultural hangover in the modern world, and in particular in the modern West, of some, I think, quite unfortunate bifurcations of experience that have created some difficulties. Science and spirituality, I would say, is one of them. Mind and reason is one of them. The reason, the rational mind, and the emotional experience that we have is another one of them. And I don't think these are inherent challenges, or that, like science and spirituality, for example, there's some inherent conflict between those. If you go back to ancient India, for example, which is the roots of so many of the meditative and contemplative traditions in Asia, philosophy, what the precursors to a scientific way of understanding, spirituality, meditative and contemplative approaches, these were all in conversation with one another from the beginning. There was not even this whole thing of like, is it philosophy? Is it science? Is it religion? Is it this? Is it that? It was, these are all just different ways that humans over time have sought to understand their own experience in for the motivation of trying to better that experience. There's this idea of science is just trying to understand how things work. But why do we do that? We do that because we think it's going to help us with something, right? So even science, though it might be, more objective, and there's all sorts of arguments about the degree to which that's true, but if nothing else, like the human experience of that is still rooted in basic questions. How can we suffer less and flourish more? And just, and then we're working with understanding the laws of physics or the principles that govern our health and the body and all these different things. So in principle, I don't see them as inherently in conflict with one another. To me, and in my own life, it might seem, I have this life at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in this research center, and then I do all this Buddhist stuff and secular meditation. Those don't really seem like very different things to me. Like I don't see them, these divisions are honestly kind of meaningless to me personally. Maybe that might just be a mental defect in my own brain, but anyways, that's how I experience it and how I see things.
Yeah, that's really
That's not
great.
to say there's not challenges, but I don't think I don't think they are fundamental inherent challenges.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And it's going to take us pretty deep here in just a second. But this is actually the way I see your work truly. And you intimated this, Cord, is you're a multivalent translator. So not only are you extraordinarily fluent as a liturgical translator, really going after texts, a dozen books that do that. You do oral translation as well, which is amazing. But what you're suggesting here is really, I think, what's most important in this day and age that's kind of under the same rubric is cultural translation. And so your ability, I mean, you're working on so many different levels. You're translating on one level, so-called East and West, even the globalization has taken those barriers down to some extent. They're still there. And you're also working to create bridges and translate between these seemingly disparate dimensions of so-called science and spirit. And so is it fair to say, and maybe we can go up this a little bit, this kind of philosophical tree, is science and spirituality, and I guess we could say Buddhism, I mean, it's a little bit, they're not completely resonant, but I think we can use those terms somewhat synonymously, as respective pursuits of the truth, and maybe just targeting different dimensions in the spectrum of truth. Is that one way you look at it, that they both have this kind of noble quality?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I think there's certainly something that cuts across virtually every philosophical, spiritual, meditative, humanistic tradition, which is the quest for understanding. And in particular, the quest for the understanding of the human experience itself. What is it that kind of governs how our minds and experience works? Why is it that we suffer at times and we seem to do well at others? Is it possible to shift the needle on any of these variables so we can push things in a more positive direction? You can go back to the conversations that Socrates had and the streets of Athens, certainly the Asian meditative traditions, all sorts of philosophical traditions, that have followed in more recent millennia, in more recent centuries. So I think you can see this kind of across the board, and certainly modern science, that's all over the place. I mean, it's really just about gaining understanding into the laws and principles that govern nature in all of its many facets. So yeah, I mean, this is just very clearly kind of wired into our DNA is that we seek to understand. Understanding, and in fact, this is in one of these many efforts to translate between cultures, and in this case, between contemplative, meditative culture and scientific culture, we published a scientific framework that focused on 4 key pillars of well-being and human flourishing that are trainable. So this was all about how we can train ourselves and learn to flourish. And insight and wisdom were one of those 4. That again, you can find it across many fields of modern science and empirical research, and of course, all these spiritual traditions and philosophical traditions. So That's a long-winded way of just saying yes.
No, it's spot on. No, it's not long-winded. It's very articulate. But one thing here that's super interesting that you're qualified to address, Cord, is, I mean, I remember years ago when I was teaching a little bit, presenting some stuff on the relationship of therapy, Western therapeutic modalities to Buddhism. I'm paraphrasing some of the blowback I got, but paraphrasing it, basically, Buddhism doesn't need therapy. I mean, like double entendre intended, right? And so, in a certain kind of parallel sense, Buddhism doesn't need science, or does it? Because I think one of the real challenges, and you and I, we both, I mean, I've traveled to 15 countries in Asia. And one of the most breathtaking things, I'm sure you've experienced this because you've been to more countries than me, is how stunningly elegant and beautiful it is as Buddhism flows in these cultural containers and takes on the milieu, the environment of the country into which it flows. It's just brilliant. And so to me, excuse me, I think one of the two, excuse me, one of the two biggest principal cultural containers of the West are in fact psychology and science. And so I guess on one level, I'm answering my own question, but I really want to hear your riff on, does, in fact, Buddhism need science? Is it a way to authentically, culturally translate? Because what I'm getting at here is the very powerful near enemy of scientism. You know, science is a brilliant, noble light, but wherever you find light, you will find shadows. And scientism is, maybe you can define it for our audience, but this is really important. You know, this kind of dominating, colonizing tendency that science can run rampant over all these traditions, and we look for it for substantiation, to prove, which of course it never does that. And so I think you see where I'm going here. So can you run on this one a little bit?
Yeah, yeah. Another interesting question. So, from a certain point of view, a kind of jaded, skeptical point of view would say, yeah, basically meditation teachers and spiritual communities are kind of just using science for marketing. It is the currency of the modern world, and the language, and the thing we tend to have implicit faith in the same way that people had implicit faith in religious traditions in centuries past, and of course, to some degree still do. But people accept science in a way that they don't accept other things, just basic things that we just assume to be true because scientists have told us they're true, but we have never validated ourselves. We could just talk about the cells. Like, have you seen a cell in your body? No, you probably have not seen that, but you just know that you quote unquote know that it's true. Why? Because you assume
Mhm.
that these scientists that are sort of the priests of the modern world are telling you the truth. It's not all that different than the way that, a literal priest would have said that centuries ago, and the way that people would have just accepted what they're saying is truth. You can argue about, the basis for them making these claims and all sorts of things. So I don't want to make them sound as though they're equivalent. But what is similar is this cultural thing where we just accept the authority of whoever we deem to be, the most credible sources of wisdom and information at any point in history. Right now, that just happens to be, for most people, scientists. Not everybody, but for a lot of people. But I think, not surprisingly, I am a scientist and I work in a scientific lab, so I can't claim to be entirely unbiased here. But I think science has a lot to add to the spiritual meditative traditions, really from a very practical point of view. If you go back to the roots of, say, Buddhist meditation, which is the tradition that I'm most familiar with, what you'll find is that there is a lot there's an emphasis on tailoring practices to the individual. For example, I'm just going to give one example here. And really the way that happened was the skill of the teacher, and in particular, the level of realization of the teacher, a teacher who themselves had come to some deep realization and had some capacity to essentially read the student and what would be most beneficial to them. And they could adjust the teachings and say, oh, for you, do this practice, or right now you need a little more of this and a little less of that. And now we have this situation, which I think is a wonderful situation, where these practices have spread far, far beyond into the mainstream to numbers of people that were unthinkable in previous generations. It was always a very select few that was getting this deep meditation instruction. And that one-on-one tailoring that we just talked about, that was doable when you have a very small number of people that are getting the training and a very small number of people that are equipped to deliver the instructions. Now, you can download an app and start meditating. And the question is, how can you provide an effective
Mm, mm,
experience for people,
mm,
given that we're just not in that traditional context anymore? This is where I think science steps in. We can use, for example, now these large language models, big
mhm.
data, machine learning. We can use technology to help figure out what works for whom under what circumstances, uh, in a way that's actually scalable. So it's not just a one size fits all approach. So, for example, we created this Healthy Minds app, which originally we thought would just be for our own research. It's uh, grown much farther and faster than we ever anticipated. But the good thing about that is that it's given us access to large data, big data that we can analyze to
Mm,
ask certain questions. So,
mm.
one of the big things we tried as an experiment with the Healthy Minds program is we created every practice in the app, and there's more than 200 of them. It's a very kind of
Oh, wow.
structured, guided journey based on this model of the scientific model of well-being that we created. But we created every practice so you could do it as a sitting meditation or as an active practice.
Mhm.
So literally, you could do the whole training and never sit down to meditate. You could do it while you're out going for a walk or commuting to work or doing the laundry. But we had no idea if that would be as effective for people as doing formal sitting meditation. And what we've learned is that at least now in multiple randomized controlled trials with pretty big samples, we've seen that at least in the early stages of practice, people benefit as much from the active
Wow.
practices
Wow.
as they do from the sitting practices.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, anyways, that's just one example, and where I think that modern science is basically it's it's just going to help us be more skillful with how we can tailor these practices and principles and teachings in a way that's going to make them more helpful for people and hopefully even more widely applicable to different groups of people.
That's really brilliant. And that's spot on. I mean, what elegant application. It's really like what the Dalai Lama often talks about, and you work with it, translational research, translational spirituality, which was, I mean, this was his exhortation maybe 15 years ago with Mind and Life. Everybody get together and they'd have these great, amazing discussions. And then like, okay, well, then what? And then his prescient comment is like, we got to help people. Let's get out there and use what we're doing here and literally translate it into applicability. So this is so great. So what other, I mean, there's even what we've talked about here, there's so many directions to run. But what other surprises have you already gleaned? And is this pure citizen science, or are you actually collecting hard data and able to run with that? But what other surprises have come up? Because the first one is already pretty cool, that it's just as
Yeah.
efficacious to engage in movement-oriented practices than it is to do the stasis practices. That's no small thing.
Yeah, there's lots of interesting things that have come up. In fact, you just mentioned His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We've been fortunate to spend some time with him. He was really the inspiration in many ways, along with Mingyur Rinpoche, whose teachings are kind of all over the Healthy Minds app and the way we're thinking about things. But we had a few meetings with the Dalai Lama, one of which in particular totally changed our approach and was very, very pivotal. And I'm happy to share a little bit about that if it
Please.
feels interesting. And then, yeah, maybe I can share that now, and then we could circle back to
Yeah.
the other point you just brought up. So when we were building the Healthy Minds app, we first had come up with this framework that I mentioned a moment ago that focuses on these four, what we call the four pillars of well-being. So they're awareness, connection, insight, and purpose. We published a paper on this that kind of shows the biological basis, in particular the neural, kind of the brain basis for training these qualities. We showed the empirical basis for the relationship between each of these and well-being and mental health. And then we showed evidence for the trainability of each of these in using kind of wonky terms, the plasticity. Richie, the colleague who you know well, Andrew, and who I work with, Richie Davidson, he loves to talk about the plasticity of all this stuff. So basically, it just means that it's changeable, right? It's not fixed. So we had been working on this, and we've been developing this program to train these primarily because we want to study it. We wanted to research and ask important scientific questions and have a basis for doing our research. So that's why we built the program to begin with. We really struggled with the insight section because I'm coming, from a Buddhist point of view, Richie is a very world-renowned scientist, but he also is Buddhist, and that's his own personal practice. And when we got to the insight section, we were a little bit stuck. Like, how,
Mm.
are we going to start talking about selflessness and emptiness and interdependence and all this kind of Buddhist concepts, and how are we going to make those feel secular? And because we wanted this to be something that anybody could use regardless of their religious or cultural orientation. And His Holiness came to Madison a number of years ago, and this is back in maybe 2015,
Mm.
somewhere around there. So this is quite a while ago. Um, and we spent an hour with him, and among other things, we asked him about this. And he gave us an answer that completely shifted our
Mm.
entire approach. He said he kind of almost like cut us off halfway through sentence when we were talking about emptiness and how we might talk about that in a secular way. And he basically said something like, no, that's Buddhist business. I like remember that phrase. It's like, that's Buddhist business. Like, don't worry about that. He said, what you need to do is take the meditative approach and apply it to scientific insights. So you could
Mm.
take some basic scientific insight. It could be something as simple as, not even like quantum mechanics, something just like Newtonian physics, for example, right? And even that, if you really applied that as a perspective to view your experience, to shift the way you're viewing yourself and the world, that would be a
Mm.
profound shift, right? The problem is scientists don't do that, right? They have the theory, but they're never looking at their own life, their own emotions, their own reactions, the world around them through that lens, right? It's sort of a conceptual framing that they use in the research, and it kind of ends there. And he was suggesting something very different, and that opened up this whole world for us, which is something that we used a lot in the whole Healthy Minds program app, where we've tried to marry interesting scientific insights with meditative uh, approaches, where people can actually translate some of the insights into direct experience in a way that's
Mm.
hopefully
Beautiful.
hopefully meaningful to them. So we've now run a whole bunch of really rigorous scientific experiments, what we call RCTs, or randomized controlled trials,
Mm.
sometimes with more than 1,000 people. And we've been collaborating. We've been very fortunate to collaborate with some of the best labs and centers in the world, on a whole range of fields, everything from the microbiome to epigenetics to machine
Mm.
learning and AI. So we've really been quite fortunate. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot to share in terms of what we've discovered. I think the most heartening things we have discovered is that at the early stages, dosage, meaning
Mm.
how much you practice, doesn't seem to make that much a difference. And we don't know what the lower end of this is, because the lowest we've really studied is 5 minutes of daily practice. But what we can say is that even for that lowest quote unquote dosage, which is just a scientific way of like the amount that you do, that even 4 to 5 minutes a day over the course of a month leads to these really, really substantial changes. So improvements in things
Mm.
like depression, anxiety, stress, or positive things like how perceived levels of social connection, levels of attention, mindfulness, all the positive stuff, improvements on the order of 20 to 30% in just a
Wow.
few minutes a day for a month. And if for people who use the app for over a year, for example, we see improvements in overall well-being on the order of 50 to 60%, through very modest amounts of practice. So that's been really heartening, because it just shows you don't have to meditate for 45 minutes right out of the gate. It's our hunch, and this is something we want to study. So this is more hypothesis than we have the data for this. Our hunch is that the benefits at the beginning are primarily from a shift in mindset.
Yeah.
It's really you're changing your perspective. That's the first thing that really
Mm.
shifts. And that's a lot of the benefits come from that shift in mindset. And then slowly on that basis, you might rewire your ability to pay attention or be more empathetic or all sorts of other things. But that stuff probably takes time. But the mindset,
Well,
that can change in a moment. Like you can change that right now just for a little shift in your own inner landscape.
This is just bloody spectacular. I mean, a couple of things come to mind. Again, there's so much to talk about here. One is I learned a meditation from my Mahamudra teacher, Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso
Mm.
Rinpoche, who I have to say, I can't tell you how often I use this court, and I teach it probably more than any other practice. Literally one breath meditation session.
Mm.
One breath. It's like taking a little sip of space. And
Yeah.
I use it every time I feel a little contraction, I feel a little speediness. It's a little like Bardo yoga, a little pause, take a sip of space, one breath meditation
Yeah.
session.
I love
And
it.
to
Yeah.
me, it's like just to contextualize this for some of our listeners, this is one of the principal tenets of allegedly the two highest schools in Tibetan Buddhism, Mahamudra and Dzogchen, short sessions repeated often. So where Pulam Rinpoche used to playfully jab and deride his students, you guys are so into long meditation. He would just like say long. And I've
Yeah.
been at a
Yeah.
3-year retreat, right? So I'm into it. But I have to tell you, this one breath, you should do a study on this one breath meditation session throughout the day. And people
Yeah.
come to me, I'm a meditation instructor, as you are. I can't meditate. Okay, let's take a breath together. First meditation session complete. You can meditate, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what's so great about this, and I won't name names, but I do have to share stories with like my mother-in-law. She was reading a particular author, and this particular author was talking about the stages of shamatha and what it means to get on these stages. And basically, like, oh, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but if you don't get to 4 hours, it's just like don't bother. And basically, what happened to her, she just became so discouraged. She just said, "There's no way. I'm not even going to try." And so, this type of data is really something. I mean, talk about the
That's
power
yeah.
of science.
That's so true. And yeah, and it's a great point, and it just goes to show the point that you just made is super important because there are certain kinds of meditation that really do need cloistered retreat and very long immersive experiences by the nature of those practices. Like it's true. Like if you want to do the jhanas and like
Yeah,
shamatha practice and like really go for it, like that can be really beneficial, but you do need that. Like the wonderful thing is that at least here I'm going to speak totally from the point of view of the Tibetan tradition,
yeah,
specifically the Mahamudra and Dzogchen traditions that you just referenced. From that vantage point, the practices that are actually the most accessible, exactly what you're referencing right now, the ones that in just this one moment, like just the moment you, even not even the moment you breathe in, the moment you even remember to breathe in, like is
yeah,
enough. Like the shift has already occurred the moment
that's
you
right.
just even remember that. And that is the right now, Mingyur Rinpoche, who I study with, he talks about anytime, anywhere. And it's
Yeah,
just, it's whenever you remember it, and that's it. You don't know, there's no deeper than that. There's no place to go because you've already connected
yeah.
to what's already here, to these innate qualities. So yeah, I think that's the beauty of it. And it's not that these more immersive practices can't be really, really beautiful and beneficial. I mean, the way I view it, it's like one of the things that happens in these when you start to meditate, it's like you're just opening the doors to this inner universe. And it is endlessly fascinating to explore. So if you can go and retreat, and if you have the time and space to do that, then there's all these different practices and you can go for it and it'll be endlessly fascinating and endlessly rewarding. But there's also something, and arguably the most profound teachings are actually the ones that are just right here. And
Yeah.
you can be sitting on, a podcast or listening to a podcast, and just right now, as you're listening to this, it's just boom, you just remember, and suddenly you're in touch with the fullness of your experience. And you don't need to go anywhere or do
Yeah.
anything. There's no deeper in that, right? It's just that shift, and that's it. And then it's just effortless presence of you just rest in that flow. So
Yeah, let's put respective exclamation points on this. This is colossal. I mean, because what it does is it diminishes the otherwise intimidating factors around practice, and also I think even more importantly for me, Cord, in the narrative of your kind of MO as a bridge builder, and translator, this is a way to bridge between meditation and post-meditation, a way to literally enter lifetime retreat in the course of your daily life.
yeah,
And so this is a wonderful way to keep these two previous, this is just fantastic. These two previously disparate dimensions of human existence, right? Life and spiritual practice. Well, who did Aristotle, right? Who says they have to be separated? And so right
Mm.
here, just by doing these, what I playfully call micro dosing, just you're micro dosing the spiritual path. It's just completely, hey, I can do this. I don't
Yeah.
have to do a 10-day Vipassana retreat, not to diss it in any way. It's like, wow, I never really thought about the fact, wow, I just have to flash the quality of
Mm.
connectivity and openness, and there it is. There it's always been, right?
Yeah, it's so, a huge shift in my own practice came uh probably 2, 3 years ago. I I had this moment in my mind that I've had many times where I have a 19-year-old son, so, go back a few years, I had my son who was still in high school, had a, very busy professional life, busy family life, a lot going on, and not as much time to go on retreat as I would like to. And I noticed this kind of inner, wasn't even really a thought pattern. It's sort of like just a view I had about myself and my life that I'd had for a very long time that I kind of jokingly call a Milarepa complex, which is basically if I am not in a cave in the Himalayas for decades, anything short of that is like I'm not really meditating yet.
Right?
It's like
That's
the
perfect,
bar is so impossibly high
right?
that I'm really never going to meet it, right? Because,
Yeah,
in the tradition, it's just this tradition where you do have
yeah.
these incredible paragons of the tradition that have really have really done that. But I realized I had that thought as I had had it many times, and I suddenly realized, the tradition has come down to us largely through two streams. There's a yogic stream. This is the Milarepas of the world. The books they wrote, the stories we tell, everything is kind of coming down through this tradition of people who really were, for all intents and purposes, full-time meditators.
Yeah, professionals. Yeah.
They were professionals. Like they didn't have a 17-year-old in college. They didn't have like, two jobs and, 8 Zoom meetings a day. Like that was not their life. They literally were living in caves or in hermitages or monasteries, and they wrote the books. And they had close students who were doing the same thing they were. So that's one whole lineage. And then there's the scholastic tradition.
Mm.
And that too is really beautiful. But those people also were full-time scholars. They were largely living in monasteries. They were largely monastic, and they were studying and, doing the scholarly thing full time. And those are both beautiful and transformative pathways, but they're also not the pathways that most of us are actually going to
Mhm.
follow. And I realize there's a third historically, which is the householder. And that one, I would say, is utterly unsatisfying in its
Mhm.
traditional form, in that it's always been viewed as like the householder supports the monastic community. Basically, you're gathering merit. So hopefully in the future, you'll be able to be one of the other two. You'll be able to be a scholar or a yogi or something like that. But you're basically just gathering merit and doing positive deeds. And and then seeing that, I'm like, okay, none of those seem like very good options. Like, I don't want to just be a failed Milarepa my whole life. There's got to be something better than that. And I realized there is actually something that has been a substrand. It's never really been the mainstream in Buddhist culture, but it's there. Like in the Tibetan tradition, it's like the tradition of the Ngakpas.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of this in modern, the 20th century Burmese culture, which is quite beautiful. But it's the householder yogi. It's somebody who is has a job and a livelihood and a family, but they're not just gathering merit. They really want to meditate. They're doing retreat when they can. They're studying to some degree. And that kind of opened things up. Like a great example of this in the last century was Dipa Ma in the Theravada
Mm.
tradition,
Mhm.
who people oftentimes mention Marpa in the Tibetan lineage, but they forget the fact that Marpa spent 12 years in jungles.
Right.
Like he didn't just like, he didn't do it like hanging out with his family. He went for it as hard as anybody ever has. So like he had the family after he was awakened, not like during his path of awakening. So I think it's an important distinction. But when I realized that, it was really a helpful distinction to me because I realized that there's this traditional framework of view, meditation, and what's called conduct, or I like to call application, as sort of a way to think about the building blocks of the path. For each of those models, the formulation is different. Like the scholarly path has a lot of view, which means a lot of study, a little bit of meditation, a little bit of application. The yogic approach dials the meditation way up, and they have a little bit of study and a little bit of application. We need the model that has a little bit of study, a little bit of meditation, and dials the application way up.
Yeah.
but nobody wrote those books. We didn't get those, like those did not come down. Like that library has yet to be erected, right? Like we have to write those books,
Yeah.
and this is where technology, like building the apps, science, all this stuff can help with that. But to me, it's helpful because it's like we need to invert the whole paradigm. We
Yeah.
need to just flip it. It's like the main practice that we have in the modern world is the application. It's the daily life application. That's like it's like we don't need to be failed Milarepas. Like that's the thing we can uniquely do. But again, we need to figure out what that is and how we do it, given the very strange, odd circumstances we have. So, anyways, that to me is the exciting frontier
It's
of
huge.
Buddhism in the modern world is like, what is that? It's like the one breath, like little things like that,
Yeah.
little tips that we can weave into our lives and then just build the world around that. I think there's something magical if we can crack the code on that.
I think it's spectacular. It's really, it's almost in a certain way, you're tricking yourself into lightening up. You're
Mm.
tricking yourself into relaxing because even this conversation makes me happy. Even this conversation is like, I don't want, I shouldn't try to be Milarepa like he's already taken, right? I can be myself. But here's the question. So you talked earlier about plasticity.
Mhm.
How about the plasticity of tradition? In other words, where this is a very like middle way thing, the delicate dance between evolution, adapting, or you go extinct. This is a really interesting thing about evolution and cultural translation. So you adapt, adapt, adapt. But at what point do you adapt yourself out of existence? You become so plasticized in the pejorative sense, so
Mm.
plastic, that the tradition goes out the window. And then
Yeah.
what about lineage and what about blessing and what about that whole thing? Because as brilliant as this is, and I'm not contesting it, I guess I'm being a little bit of a devil's advocate. The near enemy here of this type of translation is extinction of the tradition. So do you actually adapt and edit the tradition out to such an extent that I get it doesn't become like the pure kind of hardcore secular Buddhism, but you see where I'm going here.
Yeah.
How do we ping off these extremes and in fact find a middle way that is authentic transplantation of the Dharma in the West?
Yeah, this is the question. And in some respects, I think history has already given us the answer in that these traditions always change and morph. In fact, this was actually when I was in Boulder for a few years at Naropa, and this was actually the topic of my master's degree was the transmission of religions. And I looked at this very traditional story, the way Tibetans talk about the transmission of Buddhism from India to Tibet. And they tell this story about Shantarakshita, who's this famous scholar and monk who's invited to Tibet. The king invites him and basically says, please build a monastery. This is going to be like the home base for the first monastic tradition in Tibet, and it's going to be the home base for Buddhism in Tibet. And basically, as the story goes, he starts building this monastery and he builds it during the day. And at the night, these kind of demons come and they tear it down. And then the next day, he builds it again, and again, they tear it down. Again, this is sort of the myth that's grown up around the tradition. Eventually, he realizes, okay, this is clearly just not working here. He goes back to the king. He says, I've done as much as I can, but you don't need me, this kind of traditional scholar. You need the wild yogi to come
A
in here and
magician.
tame these wild forces. So he invites Padmasambhava, Guru Rinpoche. Guru Rinpoche again comes and he tames the wild spirits of Tibet and kind of binds them to support the Dharma. And then again, then he joins forces with Shantarakshita. They build the monastery, and the rest is history. So I looked at this, if you think about this more from a metaphorical point of view, it's basically saying that when you try to transplant one religion into another culture without adapting anything, it falls flat. It just doesn't
Uh,
work.
yep.
And what happened with Guru Rinpoche and Padmasambhava when he came, he was engaging the shamanistic culture of Tibet at that time. And a lot of those things that were there got absorbed into the Tibetan tradition and are there to this day. In the same way that when you go to China, it's Taoism and Confucianism were kind of absorbed and morphed. Kind of they changed the Buddhist tradition changed them. You have Shinto in Japan. I mean, you could just go down the line and you'll find different versions of this. And the question is, what is that for us? I think you said it earlier. You mentioned psychology and science. In my master's thesis, I talked about capitalism and science. You can probably find a bunch of different examples, and you can see how this is actively happening. Then I think there's the question of how can that
Mm.
happen in a healthy way? Um, and you're right that there's a risk that it can veer way off one side or the other. I think the way this happens in practice, and I can see this happening all over the place now, is that as this cultural synthesis begins to happen, and it takes a very long time, it's not a decade, it's centuries that this slowly happens. You basically have two forces that are both very important. They're kind of the guardrails on either side. One is like the innovative side, and one is the conservative side, and they kind of have a way of keeping each other somewhat in check. So the conservative side is always going to be really annoyed by, these wild mavericks who are breaking the rules. The wild mavericks are always looking at the conservative like, whoa, you're old and stodgy, you don't get it, like this is never going to work. But together, it kind of creates a sort of a, like if you just had one or you just had the other, the mavericks would go way too, like then it would be exactly what you're saying. It would just veer off, spinning off into space. And individuals probably do that, right? But there's a self-correcting tendency in that it's not just one person or one tradition. It's sort of all sorts of communities, teachers, lineages that are all kind of interacting and in this flow together. So I think to cumulatively, kind of in aggregate, there's a balancing effect that happens within that. And I think it's quite beautiful when you see it that way, and that you need the mavericks. And you even need the ones that actually have gone over the line and a little too far, because then the ones who are the mavericks look and they're like, ooh, okay, I'm pushing the boundaries, but I don't want to be over there. So it kind of helps you see where's the healthy boundary and when are you now over that healthy boundary and you've become totally untethered from the tradition. So you can probably see here, I'm maybe pathologically optimistic, but I I tend to think that this is going to somehow, through some sort of Hegelian dialectic, we're going to sort of work this out.
That's exactly the word I was going to use. This is the great gift of the Hegelian dialectic, that in fact, if you don't have this dialectic, then you have all the issues of, the reification, concretization, ossification, and the like. And so what you're also talking about here is actually one of the questions I had, and you just kind of preempted it by this is taking place right now on a political level. I mean, this particular meta narrative, this mythology, in the deepest sense, is actually, if we have this view. So this is one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is how can we in fact use these types of principles, Buddhist principles, in this time of tremendous divisiveness and upheaval. Because this is one of my rants these days, Court. I put my hand over my heart at the end when I dedicate merit to my programs and I share with the group, hey, if what we're doing here today is not of benefit to each other, to this planet, it's irrelevant. It's just new age, spiritual bypassing feel-good strategy. And so I'm a little bit kind of ranting on that these days because, the spiritual bypass pathology, it's not a matter of if, it's or when. It's just, you're going to get hit by this. So take this, we're dancing just a tiny bit off, but again, it's all part of like, well, how can we use the nobility of this tradition, take it off these shelves, bring it into our lives, and how can Buddhism help us work with the duress? We did a thing after the election last week. We had 400 or 500 people that came on. They were in a heap of hurt. And so to me, a lot of it was raise your gaze, open the lens, recontextualize, see what's happened historically, see what are the forces, what gods are playing out here, what's the mythology that's playing out here, so that you can use this term earlier, recontextualize, reframe, change your perspective, and right there in that becomes the cure. So talk to us a little bit about just that. I throwing several different comments against the wall here, but run with this one, Logan.
Yeah, it's easy to kind of overcomplicate things. I think at the end of the end of the day, what is most helpful for our lives actually is pretty simple, and we can go very deep with these things and all sorts of nuance and detail. But I think if we're taking anything, for example, from the Buddhist approach, a simple way to looking at it is it's just about care and curiosity. I think on the one hand, the if I had to pick one thing that has been most influential for my own life and most impactful for me and most helpful, it's just coming back to compassion and care as the guiding motivation. And I think especially when that is paired with a little humility and curiosity, it's just this magical combination that even in the most difficult situation, like here in the US, we just had this election, a total, total mess and very difficult, regardless of where people are on the political spectrum. Obviously, it was just a super intense period. We're living. I had a meeting earlier with people who were largely outside the U.S., and they were saying how somebody was just telling me how the government just dissolved in Germany, and somebody else was saying like, oh, don't even come to Brazil. And like, I mean, we're not alone, right? Like, there's so many countries are dealing with their version of this. And it's so easy, as always happens to us as human beings, fear, anxiety, reactivity contract our awareness. And suddenly we have a way, we're just like seeing ourselves, seeing the world, relating to everything through the lens of that, the myopia of whatever that emotional experience we're having is. And I think what these traditions are saying is just, you don't have to get rid of that emotion like that. The emotion is not the problem.
Right.
The emotion actually is totally fine. In fact, there's wisdom buried deep within that emotion if we can shift the way we're relating to it. But exactly as you're saying, we just need to widen the aperture. And widening the aperture then brings us back to other elements of our experience that are also there, but we just lose sight of when we get caught, when we contract. And it's just that caring impulse and the humility, the learning, the openness, just to staying open. And I mean, I think hopefully it probably goes without saying. I mean, the whole world needs a dose of humility right now around political perspectives. Like, just we don't have it all figured out. In fact, no political theory, no theory about anything, if Buddhism tells us anything, theories themselves are always going to be flawed and not capture the fullness of experience. So it's not to say they're all the same. Like, some can be more or less harmful or more or less accurate, but just having a little bit of humility of like, all right now my mind wants to get into I know what's right and they're wrong, and just opening up that dynamic so real learning and listening can actually happen, conversation can actually happen. And when you ground that in just the very simple impulse to want to be a benefit to others, like, it's just that simple. Like, may whatever we do here, may it be beneficial to others. May this ripple out. It may not only do good in my own life, may it ripple out and help others, and even beyond that, may it help everybody somehow, indirectly, directly, whatever. Just coming back to that, and then just letting go of the outcome. I think, as a practice, like you said, the one breath thing. If I were to say my one thing, it's just pausing before any new activity, and just returning to that. May whatever I'm about to do here, may this be beneficial. May whatever happens here, may it be precisely what will be most beneficial and relieve suffering and promote well-being for whoever's connecting with this, and even beyond them, indirectly may it help all beings. You do that for just a couple seconds, kind of refresh that, reboot that between every activity, that'll change your life, right? It doesn't have to be some mind-bending contemplative inner process, right?
Exactly.
It's actually pretty simple.
Yeah, this is really great. I think, in geek speak, this is the great gift of chaos complexity theory. Power, the healthy reductionism, not reductionism into materialism, but reduction from complexity into simplicity. And so this, to me, I mean, the entire crap show that we're seeing, I think you can make a very powerful argument that it's an iterative process of basic fundamental principles of fracturing, divisiveness, distraction. It's distraction upon distraction upon distraction. And so similarly here, because because the pathology is iterative, the cure is also iterative. In other words, just like you're saying, you can come down to these fundamental reductive processes that are so simple. Simple doesn't mean easy, but simple does reduce to like, hey, wait a second. If I just do this, I mean, when I do some of my really intensive practices these days, and I'm advising others, but suggestions how to manage things, I often say, well, it's amazing. If you just take care of the present moment, everything else magically takes care of itself. And that may seem facile and dismissive, but it's not. It's truth. And so this again is really elegant, because this is like, wait a second, this really is simple. And so if we understand these principles, again, right view, you have that, gives you a better orienting strategy for how to work with all this.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
So a couple of things before, if you have a few more minutes, you are uniquely situated again. We're dancing all over, but that's okay. Because of your ability to flow between these different worlds, to look at possible near enemies and blind spots of these respective worlds. One of my passions over the number of years, Cort, has been blind spots. What am I not seeing? I often see in others what I'm blind to in myself. And so I love dancing between different paradigms, different wisdom traditions. Last couple of years, I've dived very deeply into non-dual Shiva Tantra, post-Kabbalistic traditions and Jewish mysticism, as a way to keep me humble, open, and hopefully being aware of what I'm not seeing. So when you look, if you were to advise, either anonymously or whatever, someone from the so-called East, and let's say Buddhism, and I have my own, I can posit a couple of things from my own side. What are some blind spots from both these neighborhoods? What are some blind spots in the Buddhist tradition that can, in fact, be elucidated by the West? And then conversely, what are some blind spots in the West that can be illuminated by the East?
Yeah. Well, I love that question. Yeah, there's a lot. I think there's a lot of room to explore here. One of the maybe we'll start with the blind spots of the traditions coming into the modern world. I would say it's less about East to West as it is from, kind of more traditional times past into this kind of modern crap show of a world we're currently living in, as you put it. I was trying to the S word
Right,
version of that and trying to
right. It's okay. This
so
is an adult audience.
yeah, you got there quicker. So I think one of them is that a lot of in traditional times, if you take Tibetan Buddhism as one example, but I think you could probably take your pick, almost any contemplative meditative tradition, they came into being at a time where most people were much more connected to the earth, where people had a very radically different pace of life, where the things that we are built for from an evolutionary perspective, like clans, for example, we are clannish, biologically clannish, right? We are sort of built for social relationships, but a very particular kind of social relationships. Like the way we see political division in social media is almost like our biology playing out through
Yeah,
technology and
fantastic.
the echo chambers and all of that. But that's very predictable in a way from a biological point of view because it's how we evolved. We survived by forming clans and protecting ourselves and all these different things. My point is that the traditions have evolved and grown up in a very, very different time and place. And one of the things that is what that leaves us with is right now the imbalances we have are completely different than the imbalances that were
Mhm.
likely there even 50 years ago, certainly 100 or 200 or 500 years ago, in that, we are hyper stimulated, we are hyperactive, we are processing an amount of information that is unparalleled relative to, previous generations. So it's like we just collectively, drank a gallon of coffee for breakfast and we're just like living like that, for decades and not even realizing because it's just normal, right? It's just the world we have. I don't think the I don't think I've seen the tradition adapt to that. I see different
Mhm.
teachers, like Tsoknyi Rinpoche, like he
Oh,
does
yeah.
this handshake practice. It's a brilliant way. I think there's like we have like the view, for example, that we find in non-dual traditions that I think is incredibly profound and helpful and empowering, so useful. And I feel like we also need some practices that are just helping us balance the mind-body system. I think that technology, like there's traditional things like jhana practice, but again, exactly what we talked about earlier. Like you can learn that skill set, but it's taught in a way that's going to be almost impenetrable to all but a very small group of people, like relative to the broader population. So I think we there's a bit of a blind spot uh, coming in particular from monastic cultures that have this support system and nurturing kind of built in to just what it's really like for somebody who's working two jobs and is totally burnt out and just needs help, like how they can rewire the system so they even have the space to begin to grapple with practice. So I think that's a bit of a blind spot on that side. And again, there's different teachers that are trying to work with it in different ways. So it's not that it's not being addressed, but I think we've got a lot of room to grow in that. I think on the other side, the kind of blind spots that we tend to have this is perhaps partly cultural. I don't know how much of this is kind of US and how much is
Mhm.
modern world. But I think one thing is we just want everything to be comfortable. Uh, there's there's a distrust, almost like an instinctual recoiling from discomfort, I think much more than other cultures and times and places have been used to, just because we've found ways to make life much more comfortable and to avoid discomfort. And so oftentimes, I don't think in like in a conscious way, but in a very unconscious way, we can steer away from things that are uncomfortable when oftentimes that actually might be where real growth and insight
Yeah.
is going to happen. And so there's this interesting discernment that I feel like we need to develop in as practitioners in these traditions, which is when is it healthy discomfort and when is it unhealthy
Mhm.
discomfort? And we kind of equate all discomfort with unhealthy discomfort, i.e., we need to avoid and get rid of that. But there's a whole space of healthy
Mhm.
discomfort that actually is vital for spiritual growth.
Mhm.
And so we don't always want to be in a space of discomfort because that's just not fun. If that's like the only thing we're doing. So we need like the nourishing practices. We need to build up the mind body system. But then there's times where it's like, no,
Mhm.
we need to go into actually, if we're always just sticking with the comfort zone, we're really missing the boat in terms of our own spiritual growth. And the key is sort of balancing the nourishing and the pushing up against those rough edges. But I feel like there's not a lot of cultural appetite to be going into the dark territory, but that's where the insight often happens. So I could probably go off on a long list of other things too, but that's one that came to mind as I think an especially important one for us to work with as meditators and people on these paths.
Yeah, there's this wonderful pedagogical model, the three circles, right? The really small internal circle is your comfort zone, your bubble bath. This is where everybody in the American dream, right? Well, if you just hang out in your comfort zone, we get smaller and smaller, and you're just going to drown in comfort. And then you have the larger circle, which is growth zone, stretch zone. You step outside of your comfort zone. And then outside of that, of course, is the danger zone, the risk zone, where the stretch
Yeah.
transforms into a snap. And so finding that is part of the challenge of the middle way, is not too tight, not too loose. And working with, I think Bruce Lipton said it, and I think it's really spot on. Crisis sparks evolution. Well, if you have the right view, it sparks evolution. Otherwise, crisis sparks more crisis, right?
Yeah,
So
and
if you
you can see even, the immune system is actually a great example of this. This
exactly.
is like the spiritual immune system. You don't want to develop a healthy immune system. You don't want to completely avoid all of the stressors to the immune system. In fact, you're just going to have an atrophied immune system if you do that. Like your immune system, it's like you don't want it to be constantly pushing it so far that you're sick all the time, but you want to be right in that sweet spot where your immune system is being challenged and then it grows in
Mhm.
strength. That's like the strongest immune system. So it's almost like that on a spiritual level. And the challenge is that that isn't always pleasant, right? Like that's your own internal system sort of learning and growing and adapting.
But that's where, I mean, the invitation for us listening here is, where does growth take place?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm super interested, as I am with blind spots, is what is it that affects in growth and transformation, and what is it that retards it? And I'm not growing when my belly is full and I'm sitting on the beach with a margarita. I mean, I'm not dissing it, but that's not where growth takes place. And so again, no pain, no gain. There is some validity to that, but one has to kind of find and negotiate the kind of the middle way about that. And so, Court, a couple of things, if you got just a second. First of all,
Mhm.
we got to come back to this really wonderful book. Tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write this book, and what are your aspirations for it? Because definitely want to plug
Yeah,
it. I
yeah.
really
Thank you for
enjoyed it.
mentioning. Well, honestly, I had no intention to write a book to begin with, and a woman named Casey Kemp, who was then an editor at Shambhala, reached out to me and asked if I would be interested in writing an introductory book on Buddhism. That started a long conversation. At first, I was interested, but I just thought I honestly just don't have time right now because it came at a busy period where I had a lot going on. But it got me thinking, and there was two experiences that I had had that really shifted my motivation. And the first was just remembering my own experience as a meditator. I started meditating when I was in my late teens and early 20s. This is back in the early 90s. And I felt like when I look back, there were so many books that were profoundly helpful for me at the time. Like I remember John Kabat-Zinn's "Wherever You Go, There You Are" was one of these books that I absolutely loved. I remember reading Jack Kornfield's "A Path with Heart." You know, there were books that were just really pivotal for me at the time and meant a lot to me. And looking back on those, I don't think I thought about it this way at the time, but it felt like there was a lot of great second books about Buddhism, but there weren't a lot of great first books, the ones that just would be like, okay, here's just the lay of the land. Here's what it's all about, but written from an experiential point of view for somebody who's interested in meditation. There were more academic books that gave you kind of an overview of the tradition. But to me, it felt like they weren't what I was looking for. I read a few of those or started, and it just is like, okay, this is too dry. It's like this kind of academic thing. I'm interested in the inner experience of these teachings and was looking for something to help me make sense of the Buddhist tradition more broadly. So that was one experience that I just remembered. The other one was my experience in developing programs and curriculum for Tergar, where, working under Mingyur Rinpoche's guidance, one of the things I've done for the Tergar community is working with a lot of other people on just developing a lot of the courses and programs and retreats and things like that. And there, it was the same experience in that for example, we have this whole thing called the Exploring Buddhism courses. It's a series that's just like a series of courses that are meant to give people a sense of what the tradition is all about from the point of view of this particular lineage and from an experiential point of view. So it's kind of like if you're Buddhism curious, what is it that you want to read that's just like, all right, it's not assuming you're Buddhist or even will ever become Buddhist, but here's just like what it's all about. And there too, I don't feel like we ever quite found the right book. There was books we could pull a chapter from here, an article there, but there was never like the book that's like, oh yeah, this is the book that's just like, this is the first thing that people can read just to orient everything else that comes after that. So I think it was really those two things more than anything else. And then really wanting to do this from the point of view of these nature of mind teachings, like kind of couching everything in that view. And that's maybe the one thing about the book, that it's not a book about all Buddhist lineages. It's a book about the Buddhist path from the perspective of one particular lineage, and particularly this nature of mind, the nature of mind tradition. So kind of couching everything in this more experiential, you might call fruitional view, where it's the idea that we have these innate qualities, that we're not going to kind of attain something, but rather discover something. So the idea of shifting from self-improvement mode to self-discovery mode is a kind of a theme in the book.
Yeah, that's massive. And it goes Plato, right? Anamnesis. This is massive, I think. The notion of relaxation and openness, that we already have everything we could possibly want.
Yeah.
We simply have to, it's an act of recognition. And that, again, somewhat along the lines of the one breath meditation, recognition and liberation are simultaneous. How often does it say that in the Tibetan Book of the Dead? So I think what's elegant about both these vectors is the empowerment of the immediacy of what it is that we're, so to speak, looking for. And if we have the right view, then we realize, hey, wait a second. It's just it's right here. I just have to open, relax, and take a little sip of space. And it's like, I never left it. It's always been here. So you mentioned Tergar. This is, I have to say, when people ask me, geez, where should I go? Who should I study with? There are several top tier communities that I immediately go to. And Tergar is absolutely positively one of them. Talk to us a little bit about what is Tergar? What does it mean? You mentioned Mingyur Rinpoche several different times, your relationship to him, your relationship to this organization, because this is a particular situation that I can endorse 100% because of people like you and our mutual friends that are co-teachers, senior teachers in that community, and of course, Mingyur Rinpoche himself. So talk to us a little bit about the majesty of the Tergar offering.
Yeah, so Tergar is probably obvious at this point. It's a global community under the guidance of Mingyur Rinpoche. We have a whole range of teachers at various levels, kind of working with Mingyur Rinpoche. And it's really all rooted in this whole tradition that is how we can directly experience our own awakened nature. And in particular, these lineages of Mahamudra and Dzogchen, and a whole step-by-step path for how people can explore that and experience that and hopefully bring that fully into their lives. So I would say, different communities, different teachers all have their own kind of secret, special qualities. What makes each teacher has their own kind of special secret sauce, so to speak. I think Mingyur Rinpoche's and Tergar's is twofold. One is really just getting to the essence of the teachings, like really like just boil it down to the most essential qualities that we need to explore and hopefully discover our, these qualities that we all have. So just always coming back to that, the key points, to making a living experience. So there's not a ton of like philosophy, for example. There's just enough that we need so we can bring it to bear on our own direct experience. So that kind of always just making it accessible, just not forgetting kind of the core essence of the teachings is one thing. The other thing is Mingyur Rinpoche, I would say, is just a master of constructing the path. Like how do you translate that into a step-by-step process that we can follow in our day-to-day lives, where it's like you can't help but recognize the nature of your own mind if you follow that. It's like it's so kind of clear and systematic. And he's just really good at just sort of laying that out. You find that, in these traditions themselves, like the Mahamudra tradition in particular, has just is just known for just this very deep systematic exploration of the mind. And so you kind of can't help but to realize its true nature if you really do it, if you really follow it step by step. And I would say that's Mingyur Rinpoche's secret sauce, is he's like a surgeon, like when it comes to like helping you realize the nature of mind. There's a depth and a rigor of exploring the mind in the way he presents it that I think is really, really special. And there's just a lot, I would say it's like the curse of Tibetan Buddhism more broadly. I always joke that it's like the anti-Zen, like Zen is like the laser-like simplicity. Tibetan Buddhism is like the overwhelm you with options tradition. So the good of that is that, ideally each of us can find what really works for us. So there's just a lot going on in the Tergar community. We have an amazing world of online courses and online retreats, local communities. There's just a lot to support us along the path. A lot of this, Tim Olmsted, others, a lot of this is us just kind of thinking the kind of things that we struggled with when we were practicing meditation. What were we missing? What would we have wanted, in those early days? Like I remember when I started doing the Ngundro practices, these foundational practices of Tibetan Buddhism. And I remember just like walking into a room with a lama and getting like a reading transmission where they just read it aloud to me, and then handed a little pamphlet, and then like just out the door. And then I was just like, I don't like
what now?
But like, this is like this super complicated practice, and I've got like this pamphlet. I'm like, I don't know what to do. Like, what am I supposed to do with this? So a lot of it's things like that. Like, what should we have to support people so they go to a retreat? We have something just to meet them where they're at and support them at every step of the journey. So it's been a labor of love for all of us, just kind of working together to help create that whole path and the community and all the resources. And it's been a gift of a lifetime to be part of that with many others.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary offering. The online community, the online offerings themselves are just amazing. And so, Court, as we start to wrap up, if you have time for just two more little things, hopefully not too big. You mentioned one thing here that has really been on my plate last couple of years. And you mentioned about jhanas in immersive states. For a lot of students of Tibetan Buddhism, this is a term that may not even be that familiar to them. And the issue is, why is it not so emphasized in the Tibetan tradition? Not in any way to criticize or whatever its applicability and the schools where it does have attraction, but this is an important thing these days, because there's some really interesting studies coming out. We've talked about one of them. Maybe we can say a little bit about that in just a second. But the role of meditative absorption, the promise and peril of absorption, and the role of jhanas in the Tibetan world.
Yeah. Yes, another one I could easily geek out about for a very long time. So if you look in the Tibetan tradition, the jhanas are right there in almost exactly the same form, and like it's called the samten shi in the like there's the form-based jhanas and they're we usually refer to them in different ways, but you would call them like the four dhyanas or the states of meditative absorption. There's four that are form-based and four that are formless. So it's actually exactly the same as you find in the Theravada tradition, and even the different factors, like there's, the five factors of the first jhana and so on and so forth. Those two are pretty much exactly the same. However, exactly as you just said, they are really not emphasized very much as a practice tradition, which is quite interesting. In particular, in the non-dual traditions of Mahamudra and Dzogchen, they you, there's some mention of them, but in practical terms, they're really not. They're kind of de-emphasized. Sometimes they're just simply not mentioned that much, and sometimes they're actively presented almost as an obstacle. Like it's almost like a cautionary tale. Like, okay, don't go here. And the first thing I would say about this is that there's some debate about this in the tradition. I would say what I just said, I think is kind of the mainstream view, and I've studied both Mahamudra and Dzogchen fairly widely. I would say it's pretty widely viewed that way, both in the historic tradition and in the active living tradition. I had like one of my main teachers, like I've heard actively tell people to stop practicing shamatha. So it can be even like even at that level. And I would say there's some very interesting context as to why that is. Um, I would say from a practical point of view, the one way to look at it is how much shamatha do you need? Um, and one thing that I don't think anybody disagrees with, even for the people who are more on the shamatha heavy side, which I would say is not really the mainstream, but they're out there. I would say even those people, I think what everybody would agree with is that shamatha is not the end point. It's if anything, just a foundational quality. And the debate is like, how much of it do you need, really is where the debate is. It's not, is it the main thing? Nobody says it's the main thing. But there is a question of like, do you really need it or not? And if so, how much? There's some on one end of the spectrum that say you really don't need it at all, that whatever stability you develop, you can develop in the context, for example, of recognizing nature of mind, in which you sort of inherently develop stability along the way with that, rather than developing these states of absorption as sort of a separate thing. In the Mahamudra tradition, in texts like Moonbeams of Mahamudra, which is one of the
Mhm.
classical Mahamudra texts, I think it pretty
Talk about, yeah.
clearly says there that you don't need beyond, like you don't need to go, like you have this rushing torrent, a still river, and then lake experience. You don't even need to go to the lake, i.e. into full absorption. Just the river is enough. And even at the
Mhm.
earlier stage, you can have some recognition. It's just going to be a little more challenging. Um, so the caution, so there's a question of why the caution around this.
Mhm.
And I think there's a few different reasons for it. One is simply that we all could die at any moment. That's a pretty blunt way of saying it.
One breath away. Take that
Exactly.
one
And
breath meditation.
if you like, what are the essential elements that you want to make sure you have in your tool belt? And I would say it's nature of mind and
Mhm.
it's bodhicitta
Yeah,
from the
beautiful.
Tibetan point of view.
Yep.
Those are like you cannot do it without those things, forget it. At least in these nature of mind traditions like Kagyu Nyingma school, like 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 that, those are the indispensable. Like you cannot forget those. So, and those are equally relevant at like every stage of the path. Bodhicitta at the beginning, middle, and end. Like that needs to be there at every step of the way, and it's going to deepen along with your journey as you kind of come to recognize these awakened qualities of the nature of mind. And so part of it is simply a matter of emphasis. Like, don't pay attention to the wrong things in your practice.
Mhm.
Um, another piece is that I think a lot of people would argue that you're going to get shamatha through those things.
Mhm.
Like shamatha, there's different variations, there's different flavors of shamatha. The jhanas, the absorptions are one of them. But shamatha just simply means like the stability, right? It's where you're not wavering anymore. You're no longer distracted from whatever it is you're orienting to. You can get that to an object like the breath, in which case you go into the jhanas. You can get that to nature of mind or bodhicitta infusing nature of mind, which is the ideal, right? So you're going to get that anyways if you really kind of go deeply with the practice. So I think a lot of it is really just don't take your eye off the ball. Like you don't want to spend all this time, kind of going down that route when ultimately it's not the main thing anyway. And it's hard. It's also not easy. It's not as though jhanas are easy to do. Like you can do it. And, I think there's traditions that do it and do it very well, but it's also not that it's easy. You need good conditions. You need a lot of practice, all the things we talked about earlier. So that's one piece. The other piece is I think it's just, they can be seductive. There's things that can happen, which in the Tibetan tradition are called nyam, which means kind of the byproducts of the meditative process. They can be pleasant. And specifically, there's bliss, clarity, and non-thought are the three kind of canonical pleasant nyam or pleasant meditative experiences. But there's all sorts of unpleasant ones, which are, too numerous to list, unfortunately, but dullness and agitation and all sorts of other things. And you don't want to get caught in the game of trying to win the nyam game. That is one of the biggest sidetracks in the whole meditative life. It is just, you're just trying to rearrange, the chairs on the top of the Titanic. I mean, basically is what that is. It's just you're trying to win a losing game. So the whole point, Mingyur Rinpoche often says, just like break up with the nyam before they break up with you. I love when he says
that's
that,
fantastic.
which is true, right? Like that's not the game we're trying to play here. So again, it's another variation of like, don't take your eye off the ball. So I think there's a lot of reasons, rationale for that. And I would say the general counsel is, that you need some stability, but not, you don't even need to go into the jhanas. Like even just going up near like what's called access concentration, or not even to there, is like enough. There's enough stability that you have more than enough to go into insight practices and nature of mind. So I don't want to be like too much. I mean, here I'm just presenting from the point of view of the nature of mind teachings. For me, I think there's a kind of a middle road approach here, which I don't know that anybody has quite figured this out, but I think is probably really helpful for us. That goes back to the blind spot that I mentioned around the mind-body system, and the fact that I think we're just depleted in the modern world, which means we oftentimes don't have the energy and inspiration for our practice. And when we do it, we're just a little too tired and worn out. Intellectually, we want to do it, but it's like our mind-body system is just too low energy to do it. So I think there might be some things we can draw on from the jhana traditions, both in Tibetan Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, and kind of use them not as the main thing, not like we need to go on full jhana, but I think there's some subtle things that we can use, realizing they're not the main game, but they're just to give us enough energy into the system and it's almost like microdosing. It's like used in moderation, that would be like the theme, like used in moderation. This can be a very helpful part, but just don't mistake it for the main thing that we're doing in practice, which is, realizing nature of mind and pure awareness and so forth. So that's my own personal take on it.
I think that's really, really brilliant. I just want to add a couple things here. I mean, spot on. To me, these jhana states are like the penthouse of samsara. They're still
exactly.
they sedate, but they don't liberate. And this was arguably, correct me if I'm wrong, the great contribution of the Buddha. I mean, he, in certain sense, inherited these methodologies from the developing Brahmanical tradition, which reads.
Yeah, I mean, he mastered them and was like, okay, this is great. I did it, but
close but no cigar. Exactly. Yeah. So when you're in a God realm, you only have one place to go, which is down, so to speak. And so I think that's spot on. And also, this is really important because you're a meditation instructor. You see this a lot. It's super easy to become a state junkie. You have a nyama experience, and it's a blessing and a curse. On one level, it points out what's possible, but you've created almost inevitably, because ego comes barging in, a new metric, a new bar. And if you don't meet that,
that is so important.
You get stuck. I playfully, as a retired dental surgeon, I talk about this. This is the essence of truth decay. You mistake a particular state experience. I mean, your dear friend
Yeah.
and mine, Richie Davidson, wrote a whole book on this,
Yeah.
states into traits. So I think I want to emphasize this just a little bit because it is a pandemic pathology in the spiritual and especially New Age community that it's all about feeling good. Well, it's about getting real. And sometimes getting real means dealing with some of the stuff we were talking about earlier. The thing that you would consider anti-spiritual. Where does your spirituality go when you face a crap show like last week? Where's your industrial strength meditation when you're dealing with something that you would consider the complete antithesis of the spiritual path? And so, in the spirit of making your life the path, this is really important. It's not about these meditative sweets. They'll just make your meditation sick. It's about opening and expanding, including that, but also being willing to let that go, because otherwise I think you can get seriously. Taisitu once said that these are among the most serious of all meditative traps. These are meditative, I mean, how many metaphors can I throw in? Quicksand, right? Where you just get so stuck in here that it can completely derail an entire career, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
that's it. I mean, I think it's so important. One thing we talk a lot about in the Tergar community is that, especially when it comes to these nature of mind teachings, exactly as you said, this is not a better state of mind. It is the nature of every state of mind. And as long as you're trying to win the state of mind game, you're right.
yeah,
That's exactly it. Like that is the game of samsara. Like that's the game we were
yeah,
in, before we started meditating. So we're just now applying meditation to the same paradigm, the same kind of inner landscape. And here we're saying, no, this is a new paradigm. Like this is a revolution in how we're relating to experience and where we are finding, insight and fulfillment and all these things we think we're lacking in life. And it's just that. It's not in a new state of mind. It's in this state of mind and every
exactly.
state of mind.
Exactly. That is so important. It's like I don't want to let you go. Along these lines, and I have to put a kind of wrap this aspect of it. This is one of the things that differentiates the two big terms, nirodha versus nirvana. And so the culmination, this is important to me because at these more nuanced levels, the higher you go, the more insidious are these traps because they're so subtle. And so there is a difference between Nirodha slash cessation states. And in particular, if I sent you this link to the work that's being done on Nirodha Samapati or Samapati,
Mhm.
which is super interesting, the capacity for an advanced meditator to basically turn their awareness off for up to a week. That's a real mind-bending thing. So can you say a little bit more about that without casting any criticism or dispersion on any of this? I know the researchers, I know the people involved here, so there's no criticism intended at all. It's more the spirit of elucidation and contextualization.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a really interesting one. And so let me just talk about the way the Tibetan tradition talks about these states. And I just want to underscore what you just said. This
Yeah.
is not meant to comment on any other traditions or how it's viewed in other traditions. So I'm just going to straight up say, how does the Tibetan tradition view this particular state? So this term that you mentioned, in Tibetan, we call this Gokpe Nyomjuk, which means like the meditative absorption of cessation,
Mm.
a sort of a state of deep absorption in which all the workings of normal consciousness have essentially ceased. So there are some debates about the nature of this, and in particular, whether it's just like a blank spot on the map. In other words, like when it happens to you, it's just like you literally blink out. Like the closest thing we would think about is
General,
anesthesia.
general
It's
anesthesia.
like you get some and you're just gone, right? It's not like sleeping where you have this sense of like you were there, you were just sleeping. It's like, no, you were just like blank. It's just a blank spot in your existence for a period of time. There's others who say that actually there's a thread of awareness that is
Mhm.
retained throughout that. And there's some sort of debates about that. This is probably a little bit more in the Tibet or the Theravadan side about, some people say, no, there's still like this kind of very bare awareness that's there. Others, it's like, no, it's like literally you're just gone. Like you cease to exist for whatever, whether it's 5 minutes or 5 days. In the Tibetan tradition, this is viewed as basically an obstacle, and not something to strive for. And there's some really interesting kind of Dharma theory behind this that has profound experiential implications. So there is a way to construe awakening uh, as an absence of all the stuff that we view as part of this confused world and confused human experience. So if we view our body, our mind, our emotions, all of this stuff, this is all the entirety of samsara, and therefore the state of awakening, whatever in this definition, is like the absence of all that. All that stuff sort of goes away. And there's sort of different, there's the experience of that is, from that point of view, would be that at first you come to this state of cessation as an experience. You kind of blink out. None of that is happening anymore. And then you kind of come back to your embodied existence. And essentially what's going to happen at that point is your old karmic patterns are going to continue to operate until they essentially run themselves out. So you're not gathering karma anymore. So all of what's motivating your continued existence, you're not gathering any new materials, and your existence will continue until that has has exhausted itself. And then there's essentially the full nirvana in which the karmic patterns have worn themselves out, and it's just that cessation. And then it's just that blinked out, the candle flame is snuffed out, so to speak. In the Tibetan view generally, and specifically again in these nature of mind traditions of Mahamudra and Dzogchen, there's a very, very radically different view of awakening. And it is a view of awakening that is not the cessation or the absence of these so-called samsaric experiences, like the body, the mind, the emotions, mental states, all of that, but rather a pretty radical reorienting of the relationship between them. And so, for example, if you can gain insight into the nature of those experiences, they are free in and of themselves. And so you have this idea of like the five wisdoms, like anger. If you recognize the nature of that experience, for example, you recognize the pure non-dual awareness that is the basis for the experience of anger. You have the same energetic quality and experiential flavor of the anger, but the destructive quality is essentially dissolved, and it's mirror-like wisdom. So you don't need to get rid of the anger. In a way, nothing has changed. The traditional example for this is like a hemp rope that they had in Tibet. If you light that on fire and you let it burn all the way through, it retains its shape and its color, but it's ash. If you touched it, it just crumbles. So it's kind of like that. The emotion, it looks like that you might have the same thoughts, you might have the same bodily experiences. It has all the components of anger, but because you've expanded that sphere of awareness, you've widened the aperture and you've recognized the nature of that, you don't need to get rid of the anger. You don't need to get rid of your thoughts, your body, the world. All of that can just be exactly as it is, but you've recognized the nature of that. So for that point of view, Nirodha is the cessation is a trap, because it's based in a sort of a limited view in which you have a dualistic notion of the pure, impure, awakened, samsaric, all of this stuff. And really, from the point of view of these traditions, you're trying to just dismantle that barrier and that seeming, that perceived barrier between samsara and nirvana. So it's a totally different approach to viewing the spiritual path and how you relate to your own mind, body, emotions, world, relationships, through the lens of that particular spiritual approach. So just in that one question of how cessation is viewed actually tells you everything about just the whole approach of these different traditions and how they're viewed. So again, I don't mean to say this is a critique of any other tradition. This is purely how this tradition understands itself.
Well, but actually, Mahakala Manjushri, maybe going and getting into the ring, and this is debate. It's not internecine. It's basically internal debate to talk about how can we, again, blind spots, how can we refine, what can we learn from them, what can they learn from us? Because fundamentally, these are all manifestations of the display of the mind. And we can use these different iterations to help us point out both the promise and the peril of all this sort of thing. And so the one thing I do have to say here, again, this topic, thank you so much for going so deeply into it, because I think it's incredibly interesting and it has really profound implications. And because people can get a little bit bewildered and it's like, oh my God, that's the next thing, for me. So the one thing I do want to say that I'm sure you know, but I think it's worth pointing out for our listeners, not in defense of Nirodha Samapati or Samapati, is the people that I talk to who actually engage in it is it's not so much about getting in that state itself. It's about a little bit correlative to the paper that you wrote about reconstructing and deconstructing, reconstructing and deconstructing the self. That what the Nirodha Samapati can do, it can create a new background, a new contrast medium, a canvas of mind of utter cessation, upon which, when the mind has been deconstructed to that extent, you can then come out with that contrast medium in a type of heightened microphenomenological way to see how it comes back online. And so the people that I've talked to about this, one thing that is so bloody interesting to me, Court, is their exquisite sensitivity to the 12 links of dependent origination. That usually this takes place so quickly that there's no ability to even detect what the Buddha talked about that constitutes, on one level, his enlightenment. So to me, in defense of it, it's like, well, geez, now you have this, you've slowed them down, you've ceased to such an extent that when the wheels start to come again, you can start to see how it all clicks together. And therefore, you have a greater sense of your role as a magnificent creator. You start to see the machinations and the machinery of the ego in samsara because you're coming out of this new background. So in defense of, I think you know where I'm coming from here.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot, and again, it's so important to make sure that this doesn't get into like a bifurcation of like the actual, like this is Tibetans squaring off against the, Theravadan tradition or something, because I think it's much more complex than that. But I think a lot of it has to do with the view that you bring to these practices, because you can do like you could do jhana practice, you could kind of go, even into kind of leading into these states of cessation and so forth. And you could have the view that like that is all in the service of really deeply understanding the unconditioned nature of all these experiences. You could also do it, again, whether you're a Tibetan practitioner or you're a Theravadan practitioner, with the view that the end result is to eliminate a certain range of experiences. And you could be going into the exact same, state of cessation or the state of, the jhanas or whatever. And like that whole view is going to like they might still be states of absorption and a state of cessation, but that view is going to be kind of driving the whole process to some, and so in a way, that's probably the most important thing to pay attention to is kind of what is the overarching view. Another way to look at it is that in these traditions, in a way, that one of the key distinctions between these different approaches is that they're all leading to a direct experience of the unconditioned nature of reality. All the Buddhist traditions are, right? Like whether Theravada, earliest teachings of the Buddha, there's all this discussion of the unconditioned. A lot of in the Tibetan tradition, the pathway is through the unconditioned, right? Like you kind of start with the unconditioned actually, and you go straight into that, and you're always just orienting straight to the unconditioned. So although the result is the unconditioned, the path is also the unconditioned, and you're learning to reformulate how to relate to conditioned reality while grounding in an experience of unconditioned reality. That's essentially what the path is. A lot of the other traditions in the Buddhist world are also going to the unconditioned, but the path is through deeply understanding the nature of the conditioned. And so you do all, like the marks of existence and all of this, and it's leading you to the unconditioned, but you're kind of dismantling, understanding, like here, like the 12 links and all of that, like incredibly helpful and incredibly profound and loosening up. And so it drops you into that. But the pathway is through the conditioned, right? Like that's the flavor, that is the nature of all of the things you're doing along the way. And they're both bringing you there, but the pathway is pretty different and pretty, but I think the view, going back to the view of where you're going at the end of it, is it to like a state of the absence of samsara or to the union of samsara and nirvana? There's some interesting further discussion on that point. And like, does that color what happens after that or not? That's beyond my pay grade, so I won't even go there, but you clearly triggered my inner geek here. Sorry, I'm
no.
totally
I'm totally geeking out as well, and I have to be sensitive to that because I mean, I'm not kidding. I could literally could talk to you for hours about this, but I want to be extremely sensitive to your time, Court. And maybe what this begets to me is 6 months to a year down the road, we just have to do this again.
I'd love to.
Because what we're talking about here, the psycholytic thing, this to me, the next, not the next, but an obvious question for another conversation, because I don't want to just race through it, is the extraordinary role of psychedelics these days and how that can be used. I'd love to talk to you about how this can be seen literally as a form of legitimate tantra, not as a rationalization, but in terms of contextualizing it as a modern skill set. But
I'd love to talk about that.
this
Yeah.
is such a big topic, and there's other places I want to go, but I know how busy you are, and I really want to honor your time and what you've shared, which is just so fun. We started, I wouldn't say on the shallow end of the pool, but we started
We
more
definitely got into
entry-level.
the deep end by the end of that.
But I think this is what's so great. I mean, it shows the scope and the depth of your own mind, your training, your heart, and your capacity to dance between all these worlds, which is it's a colossal contribution. And so, anything, any question I didn't ask you, or we'll save that for next time. Any kind of final
To be
comments from
continued.
you?
No, I think we covered an amazing range of territory. Amazing, obviously a window into your mind and the breadth of that. So yeah, I look forward to another conversation and
We have to do
really
it.
appreciate you having me on. Yeah.
No, it's super, super fun. And we'll attach all the links. I mean, you have so many amazing publications, studies, science, and the papers. We didn't even get to talk about your papers. I mean, your scientific papers are incredibly interesting. So that just means another time around. But Cortland, really, what you're doing in the world is no small thing. This is a life, well lived, and I look so forward to your future offerings. What you're contributing to the world is amazing, and it's a delight to have you as a friend. I learn every time I hang with you, I learn. And so thank you so much for taking time out of your life to hang with us.
Yep. Feeling is mutual. I really appreciate it. And thanks for having me on. Really, really appreciate it.
All the best to you.